comment about the homework that I returned. Please refrain from using triads in second inversion. Please do not use any 6/4 chords for these particular assignments. Not even the 1/6/4 chord, the potential 6/4. It gets into too much, you get into too much trouble. Certainly do not use 6/6/4, which I saw in a paper or two. And that goes also for the homework assignment for today. Please avoid completely. I think you can come up with better chords than to try to precede a secondary leading tone chord with than some kind of 6/4 triad. Don't use any 6/4 chords. 4/6, yeah. First inversion, yeah. But second inversion triad is what I'm trying to steer you away from. No 6/4. No second inversion triads. Okay. You have for me today workbook page 155, I believe, numbers 1, 9, and 10. And I had posted a bunch of copies outside my office, so I don't know if you all went and got one or picked one up, but I know you didn't have that page in your workbook from before. Maybe you had to go hunt it down if you still had it, or maybe you fed it to your dog from last year, I don't know. But page 155. I don't know, do dogs get protein from eating papers? Because they sure eat a lot of homework. Maybe it's tasty to them.
When we were in quarantine in March, one of my cats ripped up one of my assignments that was on the table.
Really?
I don't know why.
Oh, okay. So I wanted to ask if there are any questions regarding numbers 1, 9, or 10 on page 155. Oh, you're just
Okay, on number 9,
yeah.
it's like a question when I did that. Like, so from the, you know how it has the B and the E natural? Like the E natural in the bass and then the B flat. If I took those both down a step to a D and an A, would that be perfect fifths or not because of the E natural?
It would be what's called unequal fifths.
Is that a part writing here?
It is when the bass is involved, yes. So I was going to give you a few kind of hints. I don't know if this will help you at this stage, but in number 9, the chord that's given to you there is a 7 fully diminished 6/5 of 5. Do you have that? From the chart, our chart from semesters ago, you know this chart here. Do you know that 7 fully diminished 6/5 needs to go to a first inversion chord? Because otherwise you get those, what Kieran mentioned, you get those unequal fifths. Or if it's a half diminished 7th chord, you would get parallel perfect fifths. Neither of which is good. So for number 9, my final chord in number 9, it should be a 5/6, a first inversion 5. That'll get you the best part writing. So I just wanted to make that clear to y'all. Don't take it down to root position 5 because that'll give you some part writing errors. And take it to a first inversion 5, which means the bass, the E natural and the bass will go up by step. It'll go up by step. Okay. Another comment that I wanted to make about number 10. I believe you should have a 7 half diminished 4/2 of 5. Now, according to this chart, 7 4/2s go to 1/6/4. But this is a 7 4/2 of 5. So you might be tempted to take it to a 5/6/4. But that's a nasty, nasty, nasty chord. In other words, I don't know if any of you tried to take the last one, number 10. I don't know if any of you ended up with this chord, but that's not a good chord to take it to. What you can do is you can take it to a second inversion 7th chord. For instance, that would be a much nicer chord to take it to. In fact, on this, the handout that I gave you last class, I even have there in parentheses, I put another row on the chart, 7 4/2 of 5. Best goes to 5 4/3. best taken to 5/4/3. I don't really know what other chord you could take it to. You could maybe take it to another secondary dominant if you wanted to. But I would definitely avoid taking it to a 5 triad in second inversion.
What if we just took it to a 5/7, a root position?
5/7, let me see. Well, I don't know that that's gonna work because you see the bass note of that given chord in number 10, that's the 7th of the chord, and it needs to go down by step. Which means you're forced to write a G in the bass of the last chord of number 10. Yeah. Yeah, which one would you like? Number 10? Let me, how about that? What's an F major? See if I can clarify number 10 for you by putting it up here on the board. Just this measure here, we're in F major, and the chord that was given to you is A in the bass, D in the tenor, F in the alto, and B natural in the soprano. And it turns out that it is a 7 half diminished 4/2 of 5. Now, because of the tendency tones of this chord, you've got to follow the tendency tone rules. This is the 7th of the chord, and so it's got to come down by step, which forces a G in the bass. Forces a G in the bass. Now, initially I was saying I can see why you might be tempted to take it to this really strange but nasty chord, which I never allow, because 7/4/2 goes to a triad in second. It can go to a triad in second inversion, but that triad is normally 1/6/4, and we can write 1/6/4. We just don't write 5/6/4. Okay? If I did that, this is what I would have. I would have that. If I took it to a 5/6/4. But I'd rather you take it to a 7th chord in second inversion. That is one that's legal, 5/4/3. So if I do that, this is what happens. My secondary T, which is even is in an outer voice, what it does is it slides down by half step. I end up with that, a 5/4/3. In the key of F, this chord is C, E, G, B flat. C, E, G, B flat. But remember, when the chord you go to has a 7th, the leading tone, also the secondary leading tone, it doesn't matter, it can slide down by a half, it should slide down by a half step to produce the 7th in the chord, the 7th chord that you're trying to spell. So I think that's one of the best ways to treat that one in number 10. And let's see, to precede this chord, does anyone want to tell me what they use to precede this chord with? 4. Used a 4? Okay. Let's see how a 4 would work. It means you have a B flat, and you have a D, and you have an F, probably in a B flat area. I can see that happening. Let me see what that sounds like. We're in the key of F major. And you've got your 4, which then goes to this, which then goes to this. I do like the 5/4/3 expression. It's weird to hear that half diminished. I'm used to hearing fully diminished, which would be. Yeah, that's what they give us. Any other questions on this? Yeah.
Can I just ask on that one, could I do a 1/6 for the first chord, would that work?
This one?
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, that's what I did. I used a 1/6.
Cool.
But 4 works just fine. All right, I do want to collect this page also. So if you'll make sure your name is on it, I'll pick this one up and take a look at the part right in here. And then we'll go on and we'll finish what we need to talk about with secondary chords today. Yay, right? You have to, because B flat is the seventh of the chord. Yes.
What is piano?
Yeah, because C, E,
No.
G, B flat is the seventh number of the
Yeah.
chord. You know, we have root, third, fifth, and seventh.
And practice time?
Huh.
What all do you do?
Thank you.
Under the bed.
Oh, okay. So today, according to the assignment sheet, is the last day that we're going to be spending on secondary chords. And then starting Friday and also into next week, we're going to do just a little bit more on modulation. And then after that, we'll finish off with harmonic sequences, which is a really neat, brand new topic altogether. So today is the last, like I said, the last day on secondary dominance. And what I'd like to do, first of all, is I'd like to talk about how might you go about writing a harmonic progression, using writing the Roman numerals of a harmonic progression that includes one secondary dominant and one secondary leading tone chord. That's kind of like the purpose of the past two classes, right? We've been trying to talk about what can precede these secondary chords, so that we can write a complete progression that includes some of these chords. All right? Now, if I asked you on a quiz or test in the future to write a progression using Roman numerals of between 6 to 9 chords that includes one secondary dominant and one secondary leading tone chord, how might you go about doing that? Would you take your pencil and throw it down and say, I give up. I have no idea where to start. Well, hopefully not. I think you can write a progression that includes an instance of a secondary dominant and a secondary leading tone chord. I think you can do it in 3 easy steps. 3 simple steps. The first step I have already here on the board. If you're supposed to write a progression with Roman numerals that contains between 6 to 9 chords, well, first of all, write a progression that has that many chords with no secondary chords. Just write it with diatonic chords. So I've done that up here. I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. I've got 8 chords, so that's within my range, between 6 and 9. And this is the progression I decided on. 1, 3, 6, 4, 2, 6, 1, 6, 4, 5, 7, 1. No chromatic chords at this point, just all diatonic chords. By the way, now I know this, we talked about this last semester, probably while you guys were at home, and we were at the second half of the spring semester due to the pandemic. But do you remember there was a couple uses, the way to use this rare 3 chord? We've talked about that. One of the ways you can use a 3 chord correctly is to take it to a 6. And the reason you can take it to a 6 is because the root of a 6 chord is a fifth below the root of a 3 chord. So we would say that this 3 going to 6 is a circle progression. You can always write circle progressions. That is, you can always take a chord to another chord whose root is a fifth lower. It's always allowed in this style, tone style. Okay. Anyways, after I get to the 6th chord, if you want to look at it this way, I think of all this right here, these 3 chords, as my predominant function of the progression. And then I think of this much here as the dominant function, and this is the tonic, and this is the tonic again. I hesitate to ask this, but I had mentioned in a prior semester the 3 chord doesn't have an official function. But if we were to give it, assign it a function, you know what I called it? Yeah, I called it a pre-predominant. So if you want to think of the 3 chord as a PPD or a pre-predominant, you can, even though that's not anywhere sanctioned in any of the textbooks. It's not an official function of any kind. All right, but this is my first step. I'm going to write a progression that contains the right number of chords, and I'm going to make it a decent progression, right? I've got a well-formed progression, tonic, predominant, dominant, tonic. And I've just used diatonic chords, no secondary dominants or secondary leading tones yet. Okay? The next thing I want to do is I want to do a step 2, which I'll call secondary dominant substitution. Let's go ahead and take 2 of these diatonic chords up in this progression and substitute them with an appropriate secondary dominant. Now, how do we know how to do that? Well, the last few classes we've been talking about how if you've got, you can substitute any of these chords with a secondary dominant that shares the same root. That shares the same root. And again, that goes back to this handout that I gave you, plus the notes that you took the class before. So let's say I want to substitute a secondary dominant for this 3. First of all, I'm in C major. What is the root of a 3 chord? E, right? Now think to yourself, what secondary dominant in the key of C would also have a root of E? You know?
5 of 6.
That's right, a 5 of 6. So I'm going to substitute the 3 chord here with a 5 of 6. In fact, let me just put a 7th on there to make it extra spicy. Well, not extra spicy, but just to sound like it, I really mean it. So I'm substituting the secondary dominant. And you know what, I can use let me see if I can use a different color here. I also want to substitute a secondary dominant for one other chord. And I think I'm going to substitute it for this 2-6 here. Which secondary dominant has the same root as a 2 chord? We've looked at that as well. Remember? 5 of 5. That's right. And I'm going to put it in a very similar version. And here's another substitution. Because this chord has the same root as the one I'm substituting for. And then the rest of the chords remain the same. So this is step 2. Remember, my goal is to get a progression that contains one secondary dominant and one secondary leading tone chord. Right now, I have 2 secondary dominants. Guess what step 3 is going to be? Change one of those secondary dominants to a secondary leading tone chord. That's it. So, step 3. I'll put on here secondary leading tone substitution. The LT stands for leading tone. It does not stand for the great defensive player Lawrence Taylor, who used to play for the Giants many decades ago. Try not to confuse the Alright, so I think I'm going to substitute the secondary leading tone chord for this one. So let me get the rest of this written in here. 6 and 4. Okay, now, If I wanna just rewrite this secondary dominant as a secondary leading tone chord, what secondary leading tone chord would be good to use here? Does it have to have the same root? No, it doesn't have to have the same root as any of these. It just has to have the same function. When you substitute a secondary leading tone for a secondary dominant, just make sure that it tonicizes the same chord. So for instance, and again, the inversion is, I'm not really picky about the inversion, but this would be a wonderful substitution for this. Because this tonicizes the same chord as this. And that's the way you move between these kinds of chords, a secondary dominant and a secondary leading tone. And I probably have no ink left in here. Oh, look at that. Oh, wait, what happened? And then the rest of the progression remains the same. So, if I ever ask you in the future, like on a test, write a progression with Roman numerals that contains one secondary dominant and one secondary leading tone chord used correctly, I would probably advise you to go through these 3 steps. First of all, write a decent, well-formed progression with just diatonic. Then I would take 2 of the diatonic chords, pick any 2 you want, and substitute the appropriate secondary dominant for them. And then step 3, take 1 of the secondary dominants you have and substitute a secondary leading tone for it. And that will be the 3rd and final step. And again, to substitute these chords have to have the same root as their diatonic counterparts. But once you get to this stage, this final substitution does not have to have the same root, it just has to tonicize the same chord. You see how both of these are secondaries of 5? That's how you substitute it, yes?
So, I don't know if you said it already, but I'm confused. How did you pick to substitute for the 3 and then the 2, 6? Like, what were the reasons you picked those 2 chords?
I guess I could have picked the 6 chord, I could have picked the 4 chord. I would probably not mess around with your cadential formula. Don't substitute for a cadet 1, 2, 6, 4, 5, 7. And I didn't want to start a progression with like a 5 or 4 or something like that, which would be a substitution for this. So it really, this one, and this one, these are really only the 4 chords that I think would be best to substitute.
So any of the predominance, basically?
Yeah, any of those, yeah. I just happened to pick these 2
Alright.
out of that bunch. But yeah, don't try to mess with your cadence. Your 1, 6, 4, 5, 1, you need that to establish the key. And I always like you to start progressions with 1, just to keep it simple. Now, let's see if I can play with the difference of these 3 progressions to see if you can hear a slight change in sound. So, we're in C major. And let's see, so the first progression was just diatonic chords. We would have secondary dominants substituted. So we have here's the 4, and then we have 5, 6, 5, 5, and then we'll go to 1, 6, 4. And then finally, the last progression that has both a secondary dominant and a secondary leading tone chord could sound something like this. There's a secondary 7 diminished 7 of 5, which would then go to this 1, 6, 4, 5, 7. I don't know. Rather than just the standard diatonic chords in the first progression, I kind of like the sound of, that's a 5, 7 of 6. There's your 6. 4, but then I go to Okay, does anyone have any questions on this? I try to break down this whole procedure to eventually get you to right here, or take you through 3 steps that I think make sense and that are logical. One step follows the next. All right. Then, what I'd like to move on to is our final topic, and that is we can talk about deceptive resolutions of secondary dominance. Deceptive resolutions of secondary dominance. Before I even get into talking about a secondary dominant resolution, let's just go back to some basics that we learned in the first semester of theory. Well, actually, it's kind of the second semester of theory, although we learned the principles in the first semester of theory. We know, for instance, that 5/7 normally goes to a 1 chord. And the 1 chord is obviously the root is a 5th below or a 4th above. You can say it either way. But if I go down a 5th from the root of a 5 chord, I get, in this case, I get a D, which is the root of a 1 chord. But sometimes 5/7 does not go to 1. Sometimes regular 5/7 resolve deceptively. That is, it goes to a 6 chord. What is the root relationship between the 2 chords when a 5/7 resolves deceptively? Put it like this, deceptive. Does the root go down a 5th? No. It actually goes up by a step, right? And that's true of all our deceptive resolutions. Because so far we've only taken 5 or 5/7. When it resolves deceptively, we've taken it to 6, which means that the base just goes up a step. Oops. And that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. In fact, if I were to play those two, just to remind you of the sound, we're in the key of, what are we in the key of here? D minor? Yeah. Okay, so the first one we have, and that goes to, that's regular 5/1. Here's the deceptive resolution of 5/7. Do you remember way back in theory, I think it was theory 1, do you remember what the exceptional doubling rule was for the 6th chord when it comes immediately after a 5?
Oh, double the 3rd?
That's right. You double the 3rd of the 6th chord, not the root. So you see in this resolution chord here, the 6th, it's a B flat D F chord. Do I have 2 roots, 2 B flats? No, I'm not supposed to. I actually have the 3rd of that chord, the D. I have that doubled. Okay. So one thing we have to remember, one thing we have to remember when we resolve any chord deceptively, that is taking it to a chord whose root is a step higher, we need to remember to double the 3rd of the resolution chord. Double the 3rd of the resolution chord. Well, because when 5/7 goes to 6, or goes to a chord up a step, we have to double the 3rd. We're going to find out then that when we resolve a secondary dominant up a step, that we'll also have to double the 3rd of that resolution chord as well. Okay? So, deceptive resolutions, well, let me just show it to you here. I'm going to use the same chord writing that I have in this measure. I'm just going to put it in this measure in a different key, so that you'll see that deceptive resolution of a secondary dominant is no different than any other deceptive resolution. So, now, if I've got this same chord, A, C sharp, E, G, but I've got it in F, can anyone tell me what would the analysis of this chord be in this case? In F major, an A, C sharp, E, G chord is a 5/7 of a D chord, right? So a D chord is a 6. If I resolve this deceptively, I still take the root of this 5/7 chord, I still take it up by step like I did before, and I still have the same doubling of the third of the chord. But what is the proper Roman numeral for this chord in this key? Does this look a little funny to you? It should. A 5/7 of 6, instead of going to a 6 like we expect it to, it's going to a 4. Why on earth is that? Well, because I'm not resolving the 5/7 of the 6 normally to what we would expect. We would expect it to go to a 6. I'm actually resolving the 5/7 of 6 deceptively. In other words, this chord, instead of going to what we expect, is going to a chord whose root is just a step higher, like I did over here in a regular deceptive resolution. So I guess I'm saying is that, and composers will do this, not all the time, but sometimes, composers will, instead of resolving secondary dominants to what we expect them to go to, they'll throw you for a loop and they'll resolve them deceptively, taking you to a chord that you don't expect. But the deceptive resolution, all that is still inherent here as it was over here, because you're just going up, you're going to a chord whose root is a step higher. That's all. That's all. Okay. Now, so deceptive resolutions of secondary dominants are often the reason why sometimes a secondary dominant appears to resolve irregularly to something that you don't expect, to something that it shouldn't, you don't think it should go to. Yeah. In any deceptive resolution, it is important and imperative to double the third of the resolution chord to avoid bad parallels and or melodic augmented seconds. Okay? If I don't double the third in this chord, if I don't double the third in this chord, I'm going to have serious part breaking issues where I'll lose a lot of points. Most likely, parallel fifths or octaves or both, or a melodic augmented second creeping up or cropping up in one of the voices. Did you have a question?
Yeah, is there a way you could like show that? Like if you didn't have
Yeah, sure. I can, well, do you want me to do it here or do you want me to do it here? Doesn't matter? Okay. Let's try it over here. Let's say you weren't really paying attention and let's say you decided to do it that way, not double the third of this chord. You see how now I have parallel fifths between the bass and the alto, which is definitely wrong. You might say, well, I can still do it another way without doubling this third, and yet avoiding those parallels. And you might say, okay, I'm going to do it like this then. But now what error have I written in the soprano voice? C sharp down to B flat. That is what we call melodic augmented second interval. And those are prohibited. They're nasty. So I would end up marking it, and say, no, you can't do that. That's an augmented second. And then you lose 2 or 3 points or whatever it's worth. So the only way to get everything to work out hunky-dory is to just say, okay, we're going to change the doubling rule for this one, the one that receives the deceptive motion, so to speak, and we're going to double the third of this chord. And that way, this tendency tone is satisfied, and we don't have any of those part writing errors, those other part writing errors. And so the same thing happens here. Same thing happens here. You want to double the third. Another way to look at any deceptive resolution is to say that 2 of the voices will move up, 2 of the voices need to move down. If you remember that, that can help you avoid bad part writing errors. Same thing here. 2 of the voices move up, right? The bass and the soprano, and 2 of the voices in this case it's the inner voices, they move down. It doesn't matter necessarily which voices move up and which move down. It's just that two of them will have to go one way and two of them have to go the other way in order to avoid part writing problems. Oh, by the way, whenever you write a deceptive progression, both chords should always be in root position. Deceptive resolutions and deceptive progressions do not work well when one of the chords or both of them are inverted. The part writing, it just doesn't work out right. So notice over here, I've got a deceptive resolution of a secondary dominant. Notice that both this chord and this chord are in root position. I'll point this truth out as well. When I went from changing from 5/7 going to 1 to resolving it deceptively, how far below the expected root of D, how far below is the root of the deceptive chord? It's a third, right? And that's always true when you do a deceptive resolution. The root of the chord that you're resolving deceptively to will always be a third lower than the root of the chord you expect it to go to. Well, that's true over here too, right? Don't we expect 5/7 of 6 to go to a 6? What's the difference, the distance between the root of a 6 chord and the root of a 4 chord, which we ended up going to? It's a third. It's always a third lower. But you don't have to necessarily remember or memorize that. As long as you just remember to resolve any chord deceptively, just take it to a chord whose root is a step high. That'll get you there. Just go to a chord whose root is a step higher. Okay? Now, I'm going to make some more space to do some more of these deceptive resolutions of secondary dominance. Let's try one in a different key. Okay, we're going to the key of E major. And I'm going to give you a couple chords to start with already. Was it something I said? And then I'm going to go to this. Okay. I want to end up with 3 chords in this E major measure. I've got the first 2 chords for you. A 1 followed by a 5/7 of 4. And I want you to explain to me or tell me, how do I resolve the 5/7 of 4 deceptively? And when I do resolve it deceptively, what chord or Roman numeral is it going to go to? So now we're not going to just part like this and take this to the expected 4 chord. That's normal, right? But instead we're going to take it to a chord whose root is a step higher, which gives us a deceptive progression or a deceptive resolution, whatever you want to call it. Okay? So, let's go ahead and do that. If I'm going to a deceptive resolution, that means the root has to go up by step. So what's the bass note of this final chord going to be? F sharp. And we know that all of our chords in deceptive progressions should be in root position. So what is the Roman numeral eventually going to be of this chord?
5. That's 5.
Not a 5.
2.
Yeah, it's going to be a 2 chord, right? Because we're in E major. Again, it looks kind of funny. 5/7 of 4 going to 2. Well, it makes sense if you know that these kinds of chords can resolve deceptively, just like primary 5 chords can. Just like regular dominants can. All right, now let's see if we can get the part writing to come out correctly. You know that this chord contains F sharp, A, and C sharp. We know a couple things about our final destination chord, right? We know that we have to double the third, which means I need to have two A's. We also know that two voices need to go up and two need to come down. Well, that's one, we already took one of the voices up because we know that that's always true in the bass for a deceptive progression. What is the tendency tone, the 5/7? Do you see how the seventh will have to come down? Since we always do that, where is the seventh in this E, G, B, D chord? It's in the soprano, right? The seventh of the chord is the D natural. Okay. So that definitely has to come down. So I've got an F sharp and I've got a C sharp. Now it looks like I need two A's because I'm supposed to double the third. Don't forget to do that. So can I get the A's pretty nicely from the inner voices? No. All I do is move the top voice up, or the alto voice up I should say, and move this voice down, and now I have the third double, F sharp, A, C sharp. The third is doubled. The seventh of my seventh chord has been resolved down by step correctly, as it always should be. And it looks like, in total here, I have two voices that ended up going up, and two voices that came down. See, the bass and the alto went up, the top two, or the tenor and the soprano happened to come down. That's the way it should always turn out and work. When you resolve a secondary dominant deceptive. I've got one more example. Does anyone have any questions so far? All right. I'm going to erase this just because I'm going to need a lot of space for this next one as well. Go to a different key. I want the key of A flat. Let's start out with one of these. Right. I need someone to analyze the second chord in the key of A flat. Notice it's got a chromatic pitch. Any takers? What do you think it is?
Is it a 5, 7, 4?
It's a 5, 7, 4. It's not a 1, 7. Absolutely not. Okay. Now let's resolve this 5, 7, 4 deceptively. Instead of going to 4, it's going to go to a chord whose root is a third lower. So we expect it to go, well, I shouldn't use that terminology, sorry. Instead of expecting it to go to 4, when we resolve it deceptively, it's going to go to a what? Just like the last example. It's going to go to a 2 chord. But you can verify that because you know that the bass has to go up by step in any deceptive resolution. Okay, so let's see, this A flat is going to go up to a B flat. We know that this chord is going to be B flat, D flat, F. There are going to be 2 D flats because I want to double the third, not the root. But I also have probably a couple tendency tones to deal with in this chord. One of which is the chord's 7th. Which is the 7th of this A, C, E, G chord? The G. So that one has to come down by step. And the other tendency tone is the secondary T. As long as you just make sure that you double the third of this chord, all the other tendency tones will take care of themselves. Okay? So I've got a B flat and an F, I need two D flats. And again, I can get them easy as pie from where these notes are in the alto and tenth. So I've got the double third. The seventh of this chord has come down by 7. By the way, did the seventh of this chord come down by 7? It's an E flat, G, B flat, D flat chord. Sure enough, look at that. It did. Yeah, and everything works out right there. Let me go ahead to the piano and play this, just so you hear what it sounds like. We're going to key of A flat major. The first chord you see up there is a 5-4-3. Like that. And then it goes to a 5-7-4. And then that is resolved deceptively. So, since I'm running out of time, let me get to your assignment for Friday. It is a handout this time. Front side and just a little bit on the back. I give you some pretty thorough instructions, so as long as you just read everything, I think it'll take you step by step through what you need to do for resolving secondary dominance deceptively.
Give me an extra one so I can give it to Tristan.
Yeah, do you know where he is?
He's right now.
He's quarantining?
Yeah,